The History of Poland Podcast, Episode 49, Casimir and Ruthenia. Hello and welcome back. I hope the beginning of 2020 has been going well for you all. It's been a little while since I've published an episode, so I think a recap is probably worth our time. So let's jump right into it, shall we? We left off with King Casimir the Great signing the Treaty of Kalisz in 1343. Casimir, as many of you will no doubt recall, was one of the greatest kings that the Kingdom of Poland ever had the pleasure of being ruled by. Yet, his greatness is only beginning by the early 1340s. That's because for the first years of his reign, from say 1333 to 1343, his attention was constantly being pulled this way and that. One day, it'd be issues with the Brandenburgs, the next day with the Bohemians, and the next with the Teutonic Knights. All the while, he was facing internal dissent, and on top of all of those pressing issues, the king still had to rule and administer the state. Many of these issues were resolved through the signing of the Treaty of Kalisz, soothing relations with the Teutonic Knights. This finally freed up Casimir's plate to the point where he'd be able to focus on things he wanted to work on, rather than problems he'd inherited from his dad and other past rulers. What is it that Casimir wanted to work on? Well, the same thing that most rulers of the time wanted to work on. Their legacy, territorial conquest, honor, family, etc., etc. For Casimir, that was less world domination and more neighborly acquisition. Specifically, Casimir seemed to want Ruthenia. Now, when speaking about Ruthenia, it's important to figure out what we're really talking about. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue, but medieval chroniclers used the term Ruthenia very loosely and applied it to a number of different and sometimes contradictory things. I've not mentioned this in the past, even though I've spoken about Ruthenia briefly, but there's a good reason. There was such a lack of clear detail in those sources that one additional level of potential obfuscation wouldn't have helped any of us. Now, though, things are getting clearer in the historical record, well, somewhat, and it's worth talking about what Ruthenia actually means. Historically, some writers used it to refer to all Slavic lands, some to the land around Moscow, some as a synonym for what today is Ukraine and Belarus, and to complicate things further, these applications all shift in different directions over time. All in all, it's a nightmare to figure out which land or people group a medieval writer is referring to, and whether or not that's the same Ruthenia that's relevant to our story today with Casimir. All of that being said, what we're talking about today is the land to the southeast of Poland proper, in what is roughly modern-day Ukraine and Belarus. And even more specifically, we're talking about the land that Casimir has his eye on, which is also sometimes referred to as the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, being made up, of course, by the constituent parts of Galicia and Volhynia, as well as other smaller principalities. What were Casimir's designs on this land? Well, they seem to have evolved over time. As far as major events go, the first thing Casimir did in relation to the lands to the east was to write a letter to Pope Benedict XII in Avignon, asking that church affairs in these mixed religion lands be put under the command of the Archbishopric of Gniezno. Now, it could be that in that early time, Casimir had already been laying the groundwork for the eventual conquest of the east, but more likely was that Casimir saw the opportunity for a quick, painless win that could pay dividends at some point in the future for himself or an heir, and seized the opportunity. In terms of the actual plans Casimir had for Ruthenia and the surrounding territory, it's difficult to say exactly what they were. Some historians like to suggest that he had a master plan he executed day by day for decades, and that he knew he'd want to conquer Ruthenia from day one of his ascendancy to the throne. Other historians say that he bumbled his way into the conquest, and that there was no grand strategy. Personally, I like a bit of each theory. But to come to our own decision on what really went down, we first need the secret ingredient to any historical stew: context. In particular, we need to understand the context of what was going on in Ruthenia shortly before Casimir started to interfere. There's one major trend that defines most of the activity in this area, and to give it a name, I'd call it neighborly relations. You see, much like with Poland, the leaders of Ruthenia had to walk a fine line due to the influential and powerful states that surrounded them. To the north, they had the Lithuanians, to the west, they had Poland and Hungary. And to make matters even worse, to the east, they had the Golden Horde of the Mongols, who no one really wants to be next to. Because of who they lived next to, the rulers of Ruthenia knew they couldn't get too close to anyone in particular. If they got too close to the Poles, the Hungarians might be fine with it, but the Lithuanians wouldn't. If they got too close to the Lithuanians, the reverse might happen. If they got too close to the Horde, it might not set off alarm bells in Krakow, but much like with black holes, if you get too close to the Mongols, you'll soon find yourself inescapably in their orbit. At the same time, there are advantages to allying with or befriending any mix of these peoples. It's a tricky situation to find yourself in, and for any of us to pretend like we have an answer would be the height of foolishness. Imagine you're on one of those adventure obstacle courses high up in the trees. You're walking along a rope, barely staying upright. If you fall, you die. If you take a wrong step, you die. If you go too fast in one direction, you're likely to fall and, yes, die. If you go too slowly, you'll lose your balance, fall, and, wouldn't you know it, you die. There's no safety net. It's just the hard reality of the ground waiting for you to hit it. That's the life of the rulers of Ruthenia. This background becomes incredibly important when the leader of Ruthenia dies in the early 1320s. Without an heir in place, Ruthenia splits in two. The Principality of Volhynia going to an ally of the Lithuanians, while the Principality of Galicia going to a moderately well-connected Piast ruler named Bolesław Jerzy, or Bolesław George, depending on the source. I'm going to go with Bolesław George. Following all of that dire talk of the consequences of the balancing act falling apart, you're likely imagining that there are going to be some geopolitical consequences of the breakup of Ruthenia. And wouldn't you know it, you would be right. The biggest consequence was that the people of Ruthenia may have just been suddenly divvied up into camps that favor one state or another, but that doesn't mean that they want to become a part of some foreign kingdom. That might mean they'd have to convert to some new religion, that they'd have to adopt their commercial activity to a new standard, and generally change their way of life. No one walks into that willy-nilly, which is probably what someone should have told Bolesław George before he started ruling Galicia. And it's definitely something someone should have told him before he sent a note to Casimir saying, "Hey, when I die, let's have Galicia join the Kingdom of Poland and you can rule it." Why was that important information? Because combined with his general pro-Catholic politics, it really ticked off the leading nobles of Galicia who had invited Bolesław George to come and rule them. So much so that they evidently had him killed shortly after inviting Casimir to be the next ruler. That invitation to Casimir had been sent though, and while we don't know if Casimir really believed he had an ironclad claim to the rule of Galicia, there's no doubt his attention had shifted in that direction, sort of like the Eye of Sauron, but a little less sinister. I love the way that Paul Knoll describes this event in his book, The Rise of the Polish Monarchy. Knoll says, quote, "On April 7, 1340, the boyars poisoned Bolesław George. 10 days later, Casimir invaded Ruthenia." End quote. I explain all of that background because it's vital to know if we want to understand or guess at Casimir's initial designs on Ruthenia. Was it a grand strategy or just luck and good timing? Well, that background is one part of the puzzle, but there's one other key piece of the puzzle. What did Casimir actually do in Ruthenia when he first went in? And how can that tell us about his motivations for why he went in? And these are interesting questions to ponder. Based on the fact that he brought a relatively small number of troops with him, even if we include the Hungarian troops that joined in with his campaign, it's safe to assume that Casimir wasn't planning to conquer the entire territory on this initial go-through. Rather, his ability to quickly march in had more to do with potential plans the Poles and Hungarians had been preparing in case hostilities worsened between their states and the Mongols. Yet, any troops are significant, no matter if it's 100, 1,000, or 20,000. And using the small number of troops at his disposal, Casimir was able to sack Lvov, capture a good number of treasures, and flex his muscles for the local nobility to see. By the time he returned to Poland in late May of 1340, Casimir had familiarized himself with the geography of Ruthenia, had made a quick early win, and won the initial momentum. From late May to the end of June, Casimir rested his troops in Poland and gathered a much larger army. One source puts it at 20,000, but that's in all likelihood a gross exaggeration, and the true number could have been around 2,000 to 4,000 men. On June 24th, Casimir marched back into Ruthenia. Much like his first campaign, this was a lightning strike and lasted for just a month. It was something of a success, though, with Casimir coming to an agreement with the boyars in charge of a good chunk of Ruthenia on, as Knoll phrases it, its relation to the regnum Poloniae. At this point, I want to pause a bit and spend some time trying to answer that question I posed earlier. Was Casimir's activity in Ruthenia part of a long-held brilliant strategy, or was it just another instance of someone thinking one move ahead? Based on the evidence presented, I think it's a mix. On the one hand, I think it's pretty clear Casimir didn't have some sort of detailed plan to take over Ruthenia in the same way that Alexander had a plan to systematically conquer the world. Yet, at the same time, the speed with which he moved to take advantage of events in Ruthenia do seem to indicate he was giving the region more attention than his forebears. Between these two extremes, I think we land on a good idea of how Casimir was operating. He was someone who was able to plan for potential benefit down the road, but not someone who got fixated on any one individual goal or tactic. He was someone that could respond to events quickly, but not get so caught up in the moment that he ended up being entirely reactive. In short, he was someone who was able to look over at the horizon at what's coming down the road without ignoring what's right in front of his nose. That character becomes pretty clear over the next decade. On the surface, nothing much happened between 1341 to 1349, at least not in the sense of us being able to say, and after XYZ happened, so-and-so ruled Ruthenia. Rather, there was plenty of activity and little resolution. Without getting into the minutiae of every month during that decade, let's try to tease apart the major themes of activity. From a high level, the major activity centered on the key players: Casimir, the Lithuanians, the local rulers of Ruthenia, and the Golden Horde. Let's start with the Golden Horde. Situated to the east, the Golden Horde was a part of the Great Mongol Empire. This is very roughly speaking. In reality, the internal politics of the Mongol Empire were fractious at best and downright hostile to one another at worst, but for our purposes, the Golden Horde were the Mongols. The part of Asia that the Golden Horde ruled over extended from the Ural Mountains all the way into the uncharted and largely uncontested lands of Siberia, down into Crimea, the Caucasus, and the far side of the Caspian Sea. As an expansionist empire, the Golden Horde's primary concern in Ruthenia was evidently to conquer if possible, if not conquer then control, and if not control, then influence. As such, during the 1340s, the leaders of the Golden Horde used some of their favorite tactics to try to win the contest for Ruthenia. They employed secret dealings, bribery, blackmail, and threats of violence against those who resisted, all while promising a bounteous trading relationship for those who would support them. These tactics sometimes bore fruit and sometimes accomplished nothing. For the local rulers in Ruthenia, these tactics were also likely not as momentous as they may otherwise have been, likely because the Poles and Lithuanians were also using the same tactics, but with different motives. Faced with three large powers who were all willing to throw their weight around, the motivations of the boyars and elites of Ruthenia pivoted around the desire for independent rule and local autonomy. It was clear to nearly everyone that they would be unable to resist any of these powers on the field of battle, so it was more an exercise to resist and gain leverage for any future negotiations. Such negotiations were an ongoing process of communication between all of the interested parties, each trying to find a way to exert pressure and maintain dominance for a time. For example, the Lithuanians were continually trying to move down into Ruthenia by striking a tone of, "We're just trying to carve out our own place in the world too," with the elites of Ruthenia. Of course, that was a bit disingenuous, as the Lithuanians would very much have liked to absorb all of Ruthenia directly, if not for the wealth of the lands, then for the strategic benefit of having borderlands with Poland and the Golden Horde that could be used as a staging point for any future military endeavors. Which brings us to the Poles and the movements of Casimir during the 40s. Much like with the Lithuanians and the Golden Horde, Casimir was apparently motivated to push forward on as many fronts simultaneously as possible. The benefits were clear: more land, more wealth, new trade routes, and the friendship of the papacy, something which could not be undervalued. Now, this may come as a surprise to some of you, but when you have a bunch of rival powers, each with well-armed and funded militaries, all trying to take one piece of land, it can be a bit difficult for anyone to gain the upper hand. That's especially true if everyone is also fighting simultaneous wars in other areas, leaving their attention divided. That's pretty much exactly what happened in Ruthenia during the 40s. Everyone said it was important, no one ignored it, but at the same time it wasn't really the main focus of anyone in particular, except of course the Ruthenians, but they weren't exactly a global power. That all changed in 1349. Paul Noel provides an excellent summary of Casimir's move into Ruthenia, saying, quote, "Sometime early in September, Casimir invaded Ruthenia. Using Lvov as a point of departure, the army marched north, capturing Buez and continuing on to Vladimir, which also fell to them. In the meantime, part of the Polish army had been dispatched to the east to attack Łódź. After besieging it, the whole force marched down the valley of the Bug River until they crossed into the heart of Lithuania and invested Brest-Litovsk after a siege lasting several days, during which part of the Polish army ravaged the immediate countryside and captured minor fortifications. This stronghold fell to Casimir. Following this, the army returned to the south, successfully besieging Twem en route. The victorious king and army returned to their homeland, and on December 5th in Sandomir, Casimir titled himself, "By the grace of God, King of Poland and Lord of the land of Ruthenia," and granted the merchants of Toruń the right to go through our land of Ruthenia and to come to our city of Vladimir and there to carry on business. Casimir's use here for the first time of the phrase Lord of the land of Ruthenia indicates that he had conquered not only Galicia but also Lodomeria. The only frustration in the campaign had come at Lubart's, the leader of the Lithuanians, stronghold of Łódź. There, according to his later vice-chancellor, Casimir conceded out of his generosity the city of Łódź and its territory to Lubart. Such a statement appears to be an attempt to disguise Casimir's failure to capture the fortress, and one may doubt whether this report represents an accurate picture of events there. The ease with which Casimir conquered most of the old kingdom of Halych and Vladimir leads one to believe that his expedition took the Lithuanians by surprise, as indeed he had planned. For the moment, Casimir had achieved a greater military success than any of his Piast predecessors. Within the space of 3 months, the eastern boundaries of Poland had been extended some 150 miles southeast of Sanak into the region of Bukacic on the Strypa River, a tributary of the Dniester, and some 90 miles east from Lublin into the territory between Vladimir and Łódź. The task of conquest had only begun, however, and Casimir was to spend the next 17 years defending and extending these gains. End quote. Those 17 years, from 1349 to 1366, would be very action-packed indeed. Yet, from the standpoint of a compelling narrative, I find them somewhat lacking. As such, rather than go through them year by year as I've done with other conquests, I'll do 2 things. The first is to give an overview and a couple of takeaways, and the second is to point you in the right direction if you really want to know more about the events of those 17 years. Hopefully that will make everyone, if not happy, then satisfied. As an overview, these years started with an immediate reversal of Casimir's gains. This shouldn't come as a huge surprise, as Casimir's invasion had been successful in large part due to the lack of immediate resistance on the part of the Lithuanians. When they had overcome their surprise, a year later, they pushed back. This led to a bit of a stalemate, with both sides controlling a good chunk of the land they wanted, but neither having a definitive upper hand. Which brings me to the first main theme. These years would bring Poland and Lithuania closer together, despite the fact that they were fighting against each other for a good chunk of it. It would lead to more diplomacy, more frequent negotiations, and would also bring their borders next to each other. All of which may not sound important, and some of it may sound hostile, but contacts like these are frequently the basis for better cultural understanding, something that will be of great import when the two peoples unify into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In addition to the fight with Lithuania, these years laid the groundwork for a greater European effort to stave off the Mongol Empire. As the years went by and Casimir tried to claim more and more territory, he did so with limited support. This pushed him to, somewhat successfully, petition the papacy for assistance and to gather support from neighbors who would otherwise be rivals. Now, this is not a situation where they all suddenly become best friends and brush each other's beards, but it does draw Poland, a somewhat recently reunified kingdom if we'll all recall, closer into the brotherhood of major European states. The last thing to highlight is, of course, the territorial gains. For that, I'll turn to Paul Knoll once more. He says, with a bit of modification for clarity, quote, Casimir had not succeeded in conquering the whole of Ruthenia. Nevertheless, he had brought under his control, either directly or through a vassal, the largest and perhaps the most valuable part of it. He possessed not only the left bank of the upper reaches of the Bug River, but also a considerable area on the right bank, which included a wedge-shaped projection extending to the upper reaches of the Pripet River. In addition, as the result of his campaign in 1366, he had slightly enlarged his holdings in Ruthenia and Halych. The eastern boundary of Poland had been extended further east than ever before, and though there was some further conflict, the boundary of 1366 remained stable until Casimir's unexpected death 4 years later. End quote. Which is quite an accomplishment. And, speaking of Knoll, my recommendation, if you really want to dig into the nuance of these 17 years or so, I'd recommend getting his book, The Rise of the Polish Monarchy. To be honest, I'm not even sure if it's still in print anymore, but there are plenty of used copies of it floating around online for the intrepid book hunter. And that's where we're going to stop for this episode. In our next episode, we're going to focus on the Congress of Krakow and the end of Casimir's reign. It'll be a great time, and I hope you'll join us. As always, I want to share a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. Your support has been the lifeblood of this podcast. If you'd like to join the ranks of these esteemed supporters of the histories, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. I hope you will. It means a lot to me personally, and also happens to make this podcast possible. If you can't spare any change but you do want to support the show, please follow along on Twitter and Facebook by searching for the History of Poland podcast and by sharing these episodes with friends and family who may want to learn a little bit more about the rich history of the Polish people. And with that, I'll leave you. Until next time.